Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Janina, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Hello, wine friends, and welcome back to the first episode of 2026. Now, to start the year in the very best possible way, I am joined by two incredible voices in the world of wine and sustainability. Jane Masters, Master of Wine, and Andrew Neather. They are the co-authors of the book Rooted in Change, the stories behind sustainable wine. Now, Jane is a Master of Wine, an enologist and MBA with decades of experience in the wine trade. She's a former chairman of the Institute of Masters of Wine and a founding member of their sustainability committee. So when it comes to wine, sustainability, and how the industry is evolving, she is the perfect guide. Andrew is a British wine journalist, former political speechwriter, and former wine critic from the London Evening Standard. He now writes for Tim Atkin, Master of Wine's website, and his own Substack, that's A View from My Table. .substack.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Now, their book has already been shortlisted for the Gourmand Awards in the climate category, featured by Forbes as an essential wine read for 2025, and now obviously 2026. And in today's episode, we'll dive into vineyard practices, winemaking innovations, as well as inspiring stories of producers leading the way for a more responsible wine industry. Sustainability also includes the human side. So we'll be talking about social initiatives and labour issues. We'll discuss practical ways consumers can make choices that align with their values without losing the joy of drinking wine. And here is a fun, geeky wine fact that I got from this very book. Have you ever wondered why some grape varieties do better in the heat than others? For instance, in the southern France, Grenache does better than Syrah. Well, that's because Grenache is an isohydric variety. Other grape varieties such as Greek Acertico, Sicilian Grillo and Catarato, they are also isohydric varieties. It's where the variety can use water more efficiently, so it slows down transpiration as soon as temperatures start to rise. And if you really want to know exactly how this works, it closes its leaf's stomata much sooner in response to a soil water deficit. Who knew? Now, just before we go to the episode, I want to say a big thank you to Zeno Alcohol Liberated Wines, who are sponsoring this podcast, and I'm really happy to give them a space here on this episode. January is often where we're starting to look at our habits, not necessarily giving things up, but drinking maybe a little more intentionally. So whether you are pregnant, you're driving, managing a health condition, or you're simply experimenting with things like zebra striping. Have you heard of this? It is where you alternate between alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks. However, the challenge is always the same, finding something that actually feels grown up and tastes good. And this is where Zeno really impressed me. Their sparkling white is one of the driest non-alcoholic wines I've tasted. What I love most about the palate is actually linear, precise. It's almost like chalky in texture. And then there is still a little touch of creaminess. The bubbles are quite fine. There's nothing aggressive. And it finishes clean and refreshing rather than sweet. But there's loads of fruit on the nose. There's elderflower, peach, grapefruit. But crucially, this wine doesn't rely on sugar for texture or flavour. And I think that is probably why it actually worked with food. So if you haven't heard of Zeno, they work with an organic vineyard, partnering with a single family estate in Spain with over 170 years of history. And they use a gentle dealcoholization method that preserves the aromatics. It's this go-low technology for anyone who wants to do their research. However, Zeno spent 3 years doing research and development to make sure the final product would keep more varietal purity. And now they are being used as an industry case study around the world. They also pressurize their sparkling wine slowly overnight rather than a quick run on the bottling line. And that means that the wine finishes with 5 bars of pressure in the bottle. So champagne typically has 5 to 6 bars of pressure. So it's not actually a surprise that they were named Non-Alcoholic Producer of the Year 2025 by the LIWC. That's the London International Wine Competition. And this very sparkling wine picked up gold at both Mundus Vini and the LIWC, and a Great Taste Award for the second year in a row. So if you want to give them a go, you are going to find retailers in the show notes, but certainly they're in Waitrose stores and online with waitrosecellar.com. So grab a glass, settle in, and let us kick off 2026 by exploring the future of wine, the challenges that we face, and the remarkable way producers around the world are responding with wisdom, innovation, and heart. I hope you enjoy the episode with Jane Masters, Master of Wine, and Andrew Neather. Welcome, Andy and Jane. Thank you so much for coming on and being willing to talk about this very interesting book. I suppose I should let you both introduce yourselves first of all. So maybe, Andy, can you let us know, was there a particular wine, a memorable wine moment that got you down the path of writing about wine and I guess even sustainability?
Well, I mean, I was the Evening Standard's wine critic for about 10 years in the noughties through the teens, and then ended up doing other things. In terms of this book specifically, I mean, I've also I'm a long-time environmentalist, and I've worked in environmental communications. Specifically for this book, it was really the long succession of weather-related disasters that hit the wine world. I mean, other places as well, of course, but I mean, in particular in wine, we've had devastating fires in California, Oregon, Australia in recent years. This year in various parts of Spain, Greece and Turkey, directly affecting vineyards. We've had a whole series of absolutely devastating early frosts particularly in France, but in other places in Europe as well. We've had equally devastating hailstorms, again in France, but other places. I mean, I've seen extraordinary pictures from Argentina, for instance, of vineyards just shredded by a 20-minute hailstorm. And then we've had droughts, I mean, in Europe, most severely in Catalonia, but also in recent years in South Africa. Chile had about a 10-year drought, and it's a sort of permanent fall in rainfall. Australia. And then just most dramatically, was exactly a year ago, we had the Valencia floods, which swept away a number of vineyards, but also, more importantly, killed 230 people. So, I mean, all of this was sort of mounting up. And while there's all sorts of reports from these various places about the damage done, it seemed to me that nobody was really adding it all up together in the wine world and presenting an overall picture. So that's why I was thinking about writing about it. And I didn't actually get around to writing a book, but it's a long story how we actually did. But anyway,
we have time.
That's what the intent was.
But no, I feel like that makes a lot of sense why actually bringing this to the consumer so they really understand it from the whole spectrum of the wine industry. So Jane, what about you?
Well, I have a slightly different background to Andy. So Andy's obviously a professional writer. My background really is wine. I'm a wine professional. I've been in the wine trade for 30 plus years. I originally trained as a winemaker. I've worked in various aspects of the wine trade. And I guess, anyone that's worked in wine or anyone that enjoys wine knows just how important climate and weather conditions are to producing wine. So climate determines whether Vitis vinifera, the main plant that produces most wines around the world, whether it can actually grow in a region, and then the local climate and weather conditions during the year determine the style and the quality of wines that can be produced. So, I've always had this interest in climate, and therefore anything to do with climate change, which is going to impact wine styles, wine quality, is what led me to think about this more and more, and to try and understand what the wine trade faced in terms of challenges, what the wine trade should be doing. And, the more you get into it, the more you realize it's, not simple, that there are many, many different aspects of sustainability, and that we need to understand all of them and have a sort of overall picture in order to understand if we do something in this part of the system, if we do something in the vineyard, what impact that has on other aspects of sustainability. So that's sort of what drew me to it in the first place. And I would also say, adding to what Andy was saying about these extreme events that are happening, there have always been extreme events, the famous severe 1956 winter in Bordeaux, which annihilated many of the region's vines, which sort of died from, literally overnight. They've always happened. But as Andy says, it's the actual build-up of the number of extreme events becoming more extreme and much more frequent. But in addition to those, which are sort of headline-grabbing extreme events that sort of people think about, actually, there's just the general warming of climate and changing of seasons that already affects how the vine grows, the grapes that they produce, the balance between sugar and flavors and acidity and all of that. So I guess from a wine point of view, that's what started me off.
But I think that's what I found so fantastic about this book, is that you think, oh, okay, this is about sustainability, but you're also, I suppose, Jane, coming back, the sustainability of younger people drinking, it's not just about global warming or climate change, it's also about the rentability, it's about the social side, the ethical side. So all of this is really in the book, and the fact that from your winemaking experience, understanding that what we do in the vineyard is going to affect the flavors, as well as if it's hotter, the acidity is going to be different. So it was really interesting for me. And as you know, this has been a good read. I have not quite finished it yet, but it's really interesting the way that you're telling the story. So thank you to both of you. And I would also say one thing that, if I can remember, I recently was chatting with, it's a winery in Montana, really small. Actually, they are an English couple that moved there, and they work with really kind of local indigenous grape varieties, Moristrel. And also there was this grape variety, I think it's called Al Cañon. Never heard of it until he put up this year that hail had just devastated the entire vineyard. And apparently that vineyard is 50% of the world's Al Cañon. And so that, for me, yes, okay, no one's heard of this grape variety, and I don't know the amount, but it's going to be tiny. But you're like 50% overnight with a crazy hailstorm. So it's powerful. So where do we start? I mean, you've actually touched on, my gosh, already, I think, the shocking examples of how climate change is impacting vineyards. I mean, what about in the vineyards? Maybe we can touch on synthetic fertilisers and the agrochemicals being used. What did you find on your research around the world is happening there?
I mean, I think a lot of what we found is true not just for viticulture, but for agriculture generally. So, in the past, and still, most crops are farmed conventionally. That means, any crop has got pests and diseases. And in order to produce a crop economically and of quality, we need to protect them against those pests and diseases. And I guess, if you go back to post-Second World War, 50s, 60s, and what we call the Green Revolution, there was development of synthetic agrochemicals, which we believed at the time allowed people to farm, get consistently and better, higher yields of crop. We actually thought that this was a really, really good thing at the time. So, I just want to put that into context, because often we vilify a lot of these things, but they were done for all the right reasons. Now we know the impact that they have. So any agrochemical, whether it's a herbicide against weeds in the crop, whether it's insecticides or what we used, grapes are very susceptible actually to fungal disease. So fungicides are the biggest issue for the world of wine. So anything that we use to spray against those can have a harmful effect, because that's what it's there to do. It's to prevent disease and to kill off pests. But what we're trying to do, but we know now that has an impact not just on the target pest and disease, but that it affects all the other sort of life around the crops, whether that's above ground or below ground, but particularly in soil. So, we've lost soil fertility over the years. What we find also is that because as a result of that, whereas initially these sprays and fertilizers and agrochemicals were a means of improving yields, actually it becomes a vicious circle of diminishing returns. So the more you spray, the more you need to spray, because the soil itself has lost all its life and vitality, and it becomes more and more of a downward spiral. So yeah, people are moving away from agrochemicals. I would say the majority of vineyards are still conventionally farmed, but many people, even though they're conventional, they're looking at how they can reduce the amount of chemicals that they use, how they can apply organic biodynamic principles, but, where necessary, if necessary, have the option of using other chemicals.
I think, just to put this in perspective, and as a general point in the book, we were interested in looking at best practice. We were interested in looking at people doing the right thing. To put it in perspective, less than 10% of global wine production is organic at the moment. It's much higher some places. The highest is Austria, which is 25%.
Austria?
Organic, yeah. It was a sort of a reaction after the glycol alcohol scandal of the 80s. They went the other way and were super quality focused.
Okay.
But France is nearly up to a quarter of production organic now as well. And you've got also, as Jane was saying, there's a range of other government programs in France, other sorts of initiatives and other places where people are trying to reduce their chemical inputs. But the book tends to look at, the better practices out there. Organic, biodynamic, and also the sort of the buzzword in the wine world at the moment is regenerative viticulture, which is very interesting. I was out in California in January this year, looking specifically at this. Regenerative, there's all sorts of debates in it, but then most regenerative vineyards are also organic. If you do the regenerative bit, the key things are you don't till the soil, you don't plow the soil, because it's this idea, as Jane was saying, it's about soil life. And, it's only really in the last sort of couple of decades, I think we've started to realize just how complex soil life is. I mean, it's microbial life, it's these sort of micro funguses, as well as all various small creatures in the soil. And so if you don't break the soil, it respects that. At the same time, because you're not using pesticides, you're growing weeds, or you actually grow a cover crop. You can plant, clover or mustard seeds or whatever. And then part of the regenerative process is that you integrate animals into the vineyard. So normally sheep, and you do it in winter. So they'll eat the shoots. But before the shoots are out, so during the winter, the ideal thing is, if you find a shepherd and you have a win-win solution, they need to feed their sheep, and you need your weeds mowed and your vineyard fertilized at the same time as the sheep wander around. It's very exciting. The big question is, in a sense, as with organic and biodynamic agriculture, can it ever be big enough and mainstream enough to make a real impact in terms of the health of the planet? And the jury's out on that still. But anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's coming back from that. It's sort of turning away from the vicious circle that we've had of, this vicious circle of diminishing returns to, as Andy says, encouraging a virtuous circle. So not ploughing, allowing biodiversity to develop a series of, whether that's, as you say, bacteria, fungus in the soils, whether it's other crops and other insects and things like that. And that builds in resilience into the soil. It builds life. It captures carbon. So what we call carbon sequestration in the soil. So carbon is part of all living things. And as you build that up, that actually helps with the carbon footprint aspect as well. You're building resilience. So in periods of drought, the soil retains more water. It provides naturally more of the nutrients that the vine needs as things cycle through a life cycle and are then broken down by bacteria. So you don't need to put in as much fertilizer and things like that. As Andy says, it's all natural coming from sheep, etc. So you're building this virtuous circle.
And it's actually, honestly, I love what regenerative viticulture stands for, because effectively it's well, there's lots of parts to it, but it's healthy soils. And you even touch on in the book, and this is the bits that I just really love, all about the plant diversity living under the soils, which is at least a quarter of the world's biodiversity. It's under the soil. And apparently, I think this is what you said, 50 to 70% of organic matter is in our soil. And the part that I thought was fascinating is that if we increase the organic matter by 1%, it can increase the water holding capacity by 3.7%. So there's these incredible knock-on effects by just getting slightly healthier soil every step. That was, for me, I'm like, numbers like that are always really mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But so we talk about organics as being a bit of the gold standard. You're not spraying agrochemicals, it's killing a lot less, you're taking care more of biodiversity. But what I do like about your book is that you look at everything from both sides. There is not a perfect solution, as otherwise everyone would do it. So can we just talk about the slight downside of, I guess, organic farming, in particular, the use of copper and sulphur? If you're not responsible with it.
Yeah, for sure. As I said before, any chemicals that you're using to control pests and disease have a sort of impact on the target pest or disease that you're aiming at, but potentially on other life as well. And that's true for copper and sulphur. Whilst they're sort of naturally occurring substances, they have a certain level of toxicity. The other thing I would say is that, so they're used to control the fungal diseases that we talked about, essentially downy and powdery mildew in many places around the world. The problem with copper is that it's only effective, and sulphur actually, when they're only really effective when they're first sprayed. So it depends very much on the weather conditions and what happens around the time of spraying. So if the farmer goes into the field with a tractor, sprays, and then it rains, actually you have to go back and spray again. Whereas some of these synthetic chemicals were originally designed specifically so that they would not just sit on the outside of the leaf or the grapes or whatever. They would actually penetrate to within the plant, so that if it rains, they're still effective. They can still have an impact. So you need to spray less, potentially. But the problem is that they hang around for a lot longer, so they can have a long-term effect on other things. The fact that you're going into the vineyards maybe 2 or 3 times to spray versus 1 time to spray with a synthetic chemical also means that you're using more and more tractor fuel.
Just to give you an idea of the scale of this, I mean, sort of at the extreme, in a wet, cooler climate like England's, for instance, which is more susceptible to these various fungal diseases, producers tell me they're making sort of up to 20 or even more passes with the spray over a summer to deal with it, or over a growing season. So that's that much more.
And that would be true also for traditional regions like Bordeaux.
Yeah, and Champagne particularly. So there's all those tractor passes.
Yeah.
You're compacting the soil when you do that, and you're burning diesel. So
you're burning diesel. And the other bad thing, unfortunately, is in regions that have been growing grapes for hundreds of years, like Bordeaux, for example, and copper has been used for many years in many places. Unfortunately, it builds up in the soil, so you can get to a level where it has some soil toxicity, and that is the biggest challenge, I think, that the organic and biodynamic movements are looking for alternatives to that. At the moment, it's not easy to replace those things. So organic and biodynamic, the principles are very much in line with what we were just talking about regeneratively. They are more naturally occurring substances, but they do have a downside like anything. And and it comes back to where you're growing, the weather conditions that you have. It's much easier to be organic in, say, southern France, in Provence, than it is in Bordeaux, which is more humid.
And I think I'd just say, just sort of as a general point, this is just one of the many examples in the book of the way that there isn't a simple solution. You think you find something sustainable, which actually it isn't, or it's not sustainable in some other way. And there are loads of examples of that in the book, into things like packaging, into things like distribution and transport. I think it's one of the reasons why we don't in this book actually recommend wines that we think are sustainable. I mean, aside from the recommendations being out of date as soon as the book's printed, it just isn't that simple. And I think in a way, this goes counter to what we're sort of led to expect in a kind of advanced consumer society. We have this idea that you can choose this product rather than that one, and this will solve the problem. I mean, say it's dolphin-friendly tuna or whatever it is. And I'm afraid it's just not as simple as, if I pick that wine, that's great for the environment.
Having said that, I mean, the principle is that we think, and this is very much in keeping with organic and biodynamic farming, the more that we can reduce any chemical use and actually use preventative measures rather than curative measures after disease has struck is the way forward. So yes, I think organic and biodynamic, and equally there is a place in certain climates for conventional farming, but with using that principle of reducing as much as possible.
Yeah, we do say, I mean, we do offer some advice to consumers in the book, and that's one of the main bits, is that despite their shortcomings, organic and biodynamic are certainly better for the environment.
Well, it's interesting because we've touched on the fact that going through to spray, actually, regardless whether it's for pests, whether it is for fungus, you are going through on a tractor, you're compacting the soil, which is not good for the soil health, and you're putting diesel out into the air, which again is not good for the environment. In the book, you touch on, actually, you mentioned certain examples of people using drones now in the vineyard. I think there's one example of actually using predator insects that are good and dropping them into the vineyard.
Right.
I mean, maybe I can flick through the book and try and find.
Well, it was an example in. I remember that one. It was in California. It was a place called Booker Vineyards, and it was they've recently been certified regenerative, and the vineyard manager was telling me that she can do sort of what it was. They were dropping lacewings, which is the sort of predator insect, and they were dropping, and it would take 4 hours of work and cost substantially less than if you were spraying the whole thing. So I mean, it's a nice example of how you can actually save money by being sustainable. And I should say again, you get those throughout the book. I mean, things like transport and distribution. Going greener can actually save you money as well as being better.
Yeah, well, that one was fascinating to think that you fly up a drone, you need one person. I think it was something like 4 hours, and the whole total is £4,000 rather than, I don't know, 10 people and £10,000. Everyone listening, don't quote me.
Where technology can help us move some of these things forward. The difficulty, I guess, with drones is, you need an initial investment. They're used in all sorts of aspects, actually, as well. So I think Verkeleken in South Africa also use drones to drop insects as predators, natural predators. But drones are also used to survey vine health from aerially, to look at how irrigation can be used most efficiently and effectively, looking at vine health. So they have all sorts of roles, but it's still relatively new. It's not hugely widespread at this moment, but very exciting.
And do you think that, though, having things like drones, is this accessible to the small and the medium-sized growers, or is this still something, because, again, the initial outlay, etc., and probably, is this more for the larger operations?
No, I don't think so. I mean, a lot of this technology is really relatively cheap now. I mean, the drones, things like, for instance, the kind of sensors that you can have in the vineyard that can alert you to when the vines are in danger of water stress or heat stress. They're not particularly expensive. I mean, certainly compared to major bits of winery kit, they're quite accessible. So no, I mean, I would expect them to be used more widely.
Interesting. I mean, and so we've touched on just a little bit about in the vineyards, and that's where it often gets when we talk about sustainability. It's always vineyards, but actually there's a lot going on inside the winery where there can be some pretty big environmental impacts based on the winemaker's process. So you talked about Verkeleken. You quote, on a summer's day, they use 85,000 litres of water Now they're large. You also compare it to even Sadie, who uses 5,000 and he's very small, but you're like, wow. So water, energy, electricity. Talk to me about a little bit about your discoveries, wineries that are doing things to try and cut back there.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the winery, the biggest impact on climate change is the energy that we use for refrigeration during the winemaking process. So that represents, just for refrigeration, so cooling must as it's fermenting, chilling grapes as they come in, maintaining temperatures during fermentation, all of that is quite energy hungry. So the biggest impact that wineries can have is to move to renewable energy sources. Many of them have done that, and many of them are actually self-generating larger proportions of their energy requirements. And others are, have got opportunities to buy renewable energy at the same time as looking at the equipment that they use, how to make sure that they're being run at maximum efficiency to reduce the energy use. And then also looking at things like winemaking protocols. So if many white wines will be fermented, some of them down at 12, 13, 14 degrees centigrade, some up at around 20, but just the difference in energy requirements to reduce down to 12 degrees centigrade versus 20 is massive. So actually, if you review the protocols, you think about the yeast that you're using, there are savings that can be made. Water, as you've mentioned, is a big one. Water is used for cleaning throughout the process, whether it's the bins that bring the grapes in that need cleaning in between going back out to the vineyards, whether it's the cleaning of the tanks. And obviously, every litre of water that you use to clean equipment and surfaces creates a litre of effluent that needs to be treated as it goes out the winery. So that's another big focus.
Just to give you some examples, I mean, there's, particularly in California, I came across some great examples of people treating water. Gunlach Bunshu in Sonoma, for instance, they've got this enormous lake, which is actually part of their water treatment system, and then they reuse it mostly for irrigation. And then that stuff is, again, it's not super expensive. I mean, they power theirs by a floating solar panel array in the middle of the smaller of the two lakes.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah, and but there's all around the world that there are people using various water treatment systems. I mean, you can filter it through, if you sort of a lake with sort of reeds in it. There's various places, California, South Africa, wherever I've come across that. You filter through reed beds, and you get water at the end of it, which is certainly clean enough for irrigation. And on the electricity, I mean, I would say that you'd be surprised how much energy you can generate off the flat roof of a winery. So even in England, not particularly sunny most of the time, it was relatively small vineyards generating quite a lot of their power. Or to give you the example of Rathfinney, which are a larger producer, and they're not one of the largest, but they're big-ish, who are in Sussex. I mean, they've partnered with an energy co-op in Brighton, who actually installed the solar panels on the flat roof of the winery. They get all of their power is solar generated, and then at the same time they've got things like all of their fridges, I know, are on timers so that they go off at night and things like that. So they're cutting their energy at the same time as generating their own.
Very smart. I mean, I suppose this is the thing. There's so many different things you can do. I remember, in fact, I was very happy to see Ventisquero mentioned in the book. So I used to work for Ventisquero in Chile. And one of the things that I always thought was very impressive is that when you go through the winery, there's like a little, almost like train tracks, but they're holes so that when you're using water, it all dribbles down and then they collect it up into a reservoir to reuse, like you've just said, on the irrigation. And so now when you're thinking about building these modern wineries, it's a little bit more difficult if your infrastructure was, this is a place that was built 100 years ago, but thinking about that and just leaving like these little tracks where water can run down and you can collect it all. I was absolutely gobsmacked the first day I went to help with their harvest, and they took the hoses and they're cleaning down a tank. And when you realize to get the hose from one side of the winery to the other, the whole time the water's running, they put the hose down, it's going everywhere. And you're thinking, oh my God, no wonder so much water is used. Yet, if it's dribbling down and being recollected, then it doesn't matter so much. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because this week we were both at the Sustainability in Drinks event on Tuesday, and we were talking to Adrian Bridge from the Taylor Fladgate partnership. And, he was one of the founders of Porter Protocol and has done a lot on sustainability as well. And we were talking about a report that they're going to release fairly soon, I think, on water and water use in wineries. And just, he had some figures, which I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly the stats, but really impressive, about just by putting a nozzle on the end of the hose so that you can switch it off in situ as you do exactly what you said, walk to the other end of the winery or decide on the next tank that you're in. The amounts of water that they've saved in doing that is incredible. And he gave some stats about the amount of litres used to produce a litre of port, for example, and the drop that they'd actually achieved in this focus, which is quite amazing. So water is a big one. Just wanted to mention as well, because something that we don't often think about is actually, as part of the alcoholic fermentation, grapes are fermented by yeast into wine. And during that process, the yeast take the sugar and they convert it into the alcohol, ethanol, that gives wine its sort of flavour and body and everything. But at the same time, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And in most wineries, in most regions, and traditionally, that has just, dissipated into the air around us. But there are ways to capture it. And there are wineries like Torres and Smith-Olafitte, I think in Bordeaux is another one, that have installed systems to actually capture that at the sort of chimney at the top of the tanks as the fermentation is carrying out, and then they can actually use it later on. So many wineries will use carbon dioxide or other inert gases just to protect wines from oxidation. They can use what they capture. So it's again another example of sort of thinking a bit more creative, using resources efficiently, and having a more circular approach.
So talking about circular and all of the parts to think about, glass bottles are potentially the elephant in the room. So you talk about this, there's a big section, they are carbon heavy. Can you possibly rate down the environmental costs of a traditional wine bottle?
Sure. Well, I mean, the main factor is glass is very energy intensive to make, because you need to melt sand and the other ingredients go into it at between 1500 and 2000 degrees centigrade. Also, once you switch on a glass furnace, you can't switch it off again, because molten glass would gum up its insides. You can turn it down, but you have to run it for all of its 15 plus year life. So, and they're gas fired. I mean, the industry is making efforts to make electrically powered glass, or even to use hydrogen and so on. But for the moment, almost all glass furnaces are gas fired. So very heavy carbon emissions. That's the principal thing. The other thing is that glass is heavy. And so that when you are transporting it around the world or wherever, you need more energy to transport it. So, I mean, the things that, and just our sort of headline figure on this is that of a bottle of wine, on average, 40% of the carbon emissions are just the bottle. That is the bottle's manufacture, plus more associated with transportation. So, I mean, you can do various things about that. In terms of the glass, you can make bottles lighter, and you do come across very heavy bottles still sometimes. There was one bottle I saw in Chile, which was 1.2 kilos. This is viewed as being classy in some markets, particularly China. It's a sort of sign of how serious the bottle is. In fact, you can make bottles for still wine, this is, at 300 grams that work fine. There's still some resistance to ones that light. But the new standard that has been it's been agreed by the Sustainable Wine Roundtable. They got together with a bunch of large supermarkets and producers and importers, including Tesco and Waitrose in this country. And at the end of next year, the bottle weight accord will come into force, and all of those signatories to that will use bottles no more than 425 grams.
Okay.
And that's a big saving, because, I mean, the standard Bordeaux style bottle is between 500 and 550 grams. So in other words, you're saving, it's about a 20% saving. And when you multiply it out, around the world each year, there's about 27 billion bottles just for wine. So, if they're half a kilo each, that's
a lot.
How much is that?
I don't do maths.
Having said all of that, just to add to the conversation, if you're talking about wines that people are going to buy, to anything that has been packed, that is going to be drunk sort of over a year after it's been packed, really glass is the only alternative. So we're not saying don't buy wine in glass bottles, but what we are saying is avoid heavy glass bottles, because there is no technical need for that. A light glass bottle will keep wine as fresh and allow it to develop in the same way as a much heavier bottle.
Mm-hmm.
But it does have a big impact on the carbon footprint. The other thing that has an impact is how that bottle is sealed. So we would, again, if you're looking for what we want to do as consumers that can actually make a difference, we would definitely say cork, which is a sustainable material. It's grown mainly around the Mediterranean basin in cork oak forests, and the trees themselves will live up to 200 years. They themselves act as a natural habitat to all sorts of different species and allow biodiversity, and actually protect the regions against some of the wildfires, because cork itself is a insulant. It doesn't catch fire. So whilst cork can't be recycled like glass can, so one of the good things about glass is it can be recycled, and generally there is an infrastructure, bins, recycling schemes, they do get collected. Unfortunately, not as much actually gets made back into new bottles again as we would like, but where it can be, that is a really good way of reducing carbon footprint as well. So it's lighter weight bottles with a high recycle content is really important. Cork can't be made up back into another cork stopper, but it itself contains carbon and doesn't degrade, doesn't decompose, doesn't create any pollutants in the environment. So we would definitely say that's a good thing. On the other hand, screw caps, which have become very popular, they are very user-friendly, very easy to open. You don't need a corkscrew, all those reasons. Aluminium, yes, it's recyclable. In reality, unfortunately, most screw caps do not get recycled, because the infrastructure, the sorting systems behind recycling bins doesn't allow them to be collected and recycled effectively. So that's another thing we would say, cork over screw cap.
Yeah.
You can recycle cork as well, not to make other corks, but to make, footwear, the soles, Birkenstock for flooring. Yeah.
And so that really was quite shocking for me, how you actually explain about most people probably reading the book or listening now would say, really? I thought screw caps were absolutely fine. So that was a really interesting angle that you touch on. But also, when you talk about recycling glass, I didn't realise, as you mentioned, Andy, when you are making your glass bottles in the furnace, you're adding in sand. If you've got a green bottle, so the darker coloured bottle, it can be 96% recyclable. But because with clear glass, which is what we put our rosés in, and also we shouldn't, because it can have light strike and it can be actually affected in a negative way, the juice inside. So if only we could go over to dark glass completely. But clear glass is only 30 to 40% recyclable, because they need to make anything more than that, and you would see the glass wouldn't look good.
Just to clarify, clear glass is recyclable. It can go into the recycling system and be ground down into what we call cullet and be recycled. What you can't do is create a glass bottle with a high recycle content of cullet, because it does affect that clarity and the colour of the bottles. So you're absolutely right. And there are some producers that are bottling rosés in green glass. And definitely from a sustainability point of view, it is definitely a much better option. It also protects the quality of the wine in the bottle, as you pointed out. But we do have this sort of trade-off always with anything sustainable, and that is, the products, whether they're wine or other products, we've got to have consumers wanting to buy, and there has to be a market for them. And I guess that has been a bit like the heavy bottle conversation, it has been a nervousness, I would say, within the trade to actually move away from some of these things. There's worried about actually at a time when we're already seeing wine consumption dropping. Is it too risky to move away from some of the things that people are used to? But,
You're so right. Apparently, a few years ago, M&S, so one for those listeners that don't live in England, one of our quite larger supermarkets, they decided, no, for quality of rosé, because we don't want it to be affected by light strike, we're going to ask all of our suppliers to put their pink wine in green glass. And apparently their sales absolutely plummeted. And the next year they had to go back and say, okay, well, put it in clear glass. We need to sell it because people want to see the colour of their rosé, don't they? So that is a real tricky one. I guess as we slowly finish up on this episode, you focus on the human side of sustainability as well. And it's, I think, really important because I think there are issues affecting vineyard and winery workers that the average consumer probably has no idea about. You touch on quite a few. What stories or thoughts come to mind when I mention that?
Well, I mean, one of the main reasons I visited South Africa earlier this year was precisely because there's a particular question of labour conditions there. It's really the inheritance of apartheid, where you had this sort of horrible conditions, and it's still a poor country with very, very extreme, a very, very extreme poverty gap, and so treatment for this overwhelmingly black workforce, the field workers and other workers too, is a really key issue. And I mean, it's I could talk about it at length. It's suffice to say that I think from the point of view of British consumers, I mean, number one, the pressure from Northern European supermarkets and from organizations like the Swedish alcohol monopoly, the Systembolaget, has made a difference in South Africa. And it's because of this, there's a certification program, WITA, which now certifies around 2/3 of South African wineries. They look at working conditions and pay. They also inspect workers' housing. So there's still a way to go, and some of the conditions in South Africa are still quite shocking for a European person going there, I think. But it's sort of an example of what pressure and ultimately what European consumers can do. But I wouldn't want you to think that this is solely a sort of developing world issue. I mean, there's been a whole series of scandals recently in France, particularly in Champagne, Bordeaux as well, and elsewhere, Piemonte in Italy, for instance, of basically abuse of immigrant labourers. And it's the same kind of things that you see indeed in Britain. Gangmasters who are subcontracted to by, in this case, wine producers, who end up not paying their workers, housing them in appalling insanitary conditions, and so on. And there's been gangmasters jailed in France this year. And again, it's one of those things where it's not so much down to the consumers as it's a question of the importers, which in large part is supermarkets for most people, putting pressure on those producers to show that they're doing the right thing for their workers. Ultimately, for them to want to do that, consumers need to pressure the supermarkets, obviously. And they are making efforts in both Champagne and Bordeaux to do just that. There's a new Charter of Workers' Rights came in Bordeaux in spring of last year, and it is supposed to be making some difference.
Yeah, I was really shocked when you've got a whole section on the migrants, and it was only in 2023, 2 years ago, that they found, I think it was, you wrote 52 Africans that were found living in total squalor with mud on the floor, no ceiling, and this is Champagne.
Yes, they prosecuted the state successfully prosecuted the gangmasters. They never mentioned in court where the grapes were ultimately going, because this was probably a subcontract of a subcontract. It's perfectly possible that it could be a large champagne house that was ultimately benefiting from this, and probably selling their champagne at sort of £50 a bottle or more.
I mean, it's an issue that's not unique to wine. You get migrant workers, fruit pickers in all sorts of agricultural for different crops. And I would like to say, though, it's not social. Our chapter on social sustainability isn't just about migrant workers, because there are some real challenges. We're talking about grapes are grown, wines are made in many, many rural areas. And there has been, as you know, over the decades, a shift from rural areas into urban areas. So there are challenges around how you get skilled workers, people with a career, how you encourage, how you build a community that gives people jobs and everything that they need to have a fulfilling life. But equally, in many of the regions where wine is sold in urban centres, there are aspects of social sustainability, particularly in the hospitality and retail trade. You know, people are working long hours, not always easy to find staff. The wine trade needs people that understand a bit about wine, are passionate about it, can share that enthusiasm and knowledge with customers. So there are all sorts of other social sustainability challenges, just like there are in any other business: diversity and inclusion, equality, equal right.
There aren't, with the best will in the world, it had to be said, there aren't a lot of black faces in the UK wine trade. It is changing, but it has traditionally been very much as a white middle class and actually male dominated trade as well. And we need to work on that.
So just to sum up, in terms of our listeners who are going to run out and buy this book, so intrigued by the storytelling and the facts and figures and just really getting to understand the whole circle of wine, what would you want them to take away from the book?
I think what I'd like to take away is that, we've talked a lot about the challenges and some of the problems, and it's all a bit scary. There are a lot of challenges, but I think what I would like to think is that we can give people hope and some pointers as to the decisions that they can make, and that we can continue to enjoy wine. We can continue to have a really, nice, healthy lifestyle at the same time as doing the right thing, and that will all contribute to something that will make a difference overall to the planet, to the future of the wine trade, the future of everybody, really.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say as well, it's one of the things that I took from my travels. I was traveling for several months earlier this year researching the book, and even though there are these enormous challenges, you meet all sorts of people in the wine business doing amazing things. I think that the point of the book is for everyone, but particularly for consumers, is a starting point with sustainability and with changing things is to understand how the system works. And in particular, its global supply chains and so on are very complicated. They're more complicated than I realized. And so even if you just read the book and understand how the system works better, that's the most important start you can make. So I hope that's what people take from it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, guys. And I will link all the information to get this book in the show notes. And hopefully I can catch up with you guys soon. Talk a little bit more.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you. You take care. Thank you. So hopefully you found that a fascinating glimpse into how the wine world is adapting, innovating, and rooting itself in change for a more sustainable future. You can grab Rooted in Change from Académie de Vin via the link in my show notes. And do not forget to use my code EATSLEEP15 for 15% off this book or any of the others on that site. Now, next week, by popular demand, thank you very much, I am bringing back a flashcard episode for those studying the WSET diploma. But do not worry, you do not need to be studying to get value out of this episode. You just need to embrace the wine geekery. We'll start with a warm, sun-soaked region to escape the wintry cold, the Languedoc-Roussillon region in the south of France. And to leave you with a quote, not a wine quote, but one that sums up this episode and this time of year, said by Peter Drucker, a management consultant, educator, and author. The best way to predict the future is to create it. That to me is incredibly powerful and a great reminder as we start 2026. The future of wine and defining our own lives is something we have the power to shape. So here's to a year full of discovery, joy, and connection with good wine and great friends. Until next week, wine friends, cheers to you.